Hey everybody, Jimmy Smith. This time weighing in on the continuing controversy back and forth between Francis Ngannou and Dana White. It's gotten obviously a lot of press because Dana made some public comments about Francis Ngannou. Francis Ngannou came back, made some public comments about Dana White, and then he comes back. It's this tennis match going back and forth since he left the promotion. And there's so many angles to this, and I'm trying to keep them all straight in my head, and I'll try and break down every single one. If there's some that I miss, let me know in the comment section. I appreciate it. But a funny thing to me is there is a movie called Black Rain. If you guys have never seen it, it's good. You should check it out. Michael Douglas. It was made in the 80s. He's a cop, and he gets involved in this Yakuza thing and goes to Japan and all this stuff. So anyway, he's talking to this Yakuza boss. And the Yakuza boss is talking about a younger Yakuza boss. And he goes, his generation only cares about one thing, money. And Michael Douglas goes, what are you in it for? Love? And it's a great scene, and it's a great comment about all of this stuff. Meaning, whenever I hear this person's just in it for the money, what's a fight promoter in it for, right? What is an investor in it for? What is a CEO in it for? They're all in it for money. So the idea of that guy's in it for money somehow implies that I'm not is kind of absurd. Now, there are times when you have to choose between legacy and money. Right, that does happen sometimes. And there are times when I chose legacy, he chose money. And okay, there's a little back and forth there. But for the president of a company to say he's just in it for money is absurd, because so are you, so is everybody in this business. So I thought that was a really kind of funny. I always think of that quote when I hear somebody say, "Oh, he's just about money." The back and forth. Don Davis, of course, talking about PFLs. We have just as many top 25 fighters as UFC. It's the same product. And then Dana coming back and talking about Francis Ngannou and how they're losing money on Francis Ngannou. This is what promoters do. That's their job, is pump up their product, denigrate the other product. Now, how personally and how constantly you denigrate the other product and the other people involved in that product, it varies between promoters. But Don Davis had no problem, trashing Kayla Harrison in a way that a lot of people thought was too personal. Well, Dana White going after Francis Ngannou in a way that's very personal. Promoters do that. I don't, that's kind of what they do. You can not like the language of it. You can not like kind of how personal it gets. But pumping up your product while denigrating the other product is what promoters are supposed to do. So I never found any of that particularly shocking. The nuts and bolts of Francis Ngannou's deal. And when they originally signed this deal, the PFL originally signed him, I think it was $8 million for him, $2 million for his opponent. I understand, for purely financial reasons, everyone's decision making. You could argue with the financial realities of what's going on, the dollars and cents, that UFC would pass on Francis Ngannou. I understand that. Partly because, or mostly because, in my opinion, he went, my opponent has to get paid this. Okay, when I negotiate my rate to do commentary, I can't say, and my co-commentators have to get paid this. The company would go, you're not negotiating for other people. We're not changing our fundamental business structure or how we do things for you or anybody else. And to do that would be financially extremely difficult, right? To raise, and there are contracts like that. If you are a pro wrestling fan and know anything about the history of pro wrestling, and I do to some degree because I had to, WCW, the top guys there had a clause where when someone else got paid more, their pay went up, right? So they had to be the highest paid guy. Well, then they say, hey, bring in Dennis Rodman. Well, you got to pay Dennis Rodman a ton of money. Well, that means their pay goes up, and it leads to this increase all the way around the board. And Dana White and the UFC wasn't financially willing to do that for one heavyweight. When the deal fell through, I went, I see why the UFC wouldn't want to do that. Don Davis and PFL paying what they paid for Francis Ngannou, and are paying for Francis Ngannou. The math is very, very simple. If he's making $8 million and his opponent's making $2 million, which are the numbers I've heard most publicly, they could be wrong. That's $10 million every time Francis Ngannou steps into the cage. At a $50 pay-per-view, that's 200,000 pay-per-views right off the top to pay for your main event. And bear in mind, 200,000 pay-per-views on an event like a PFL event is a home run. That's a lot. And that all goes off the top to break even on your main event. That's not everybody else's payroll. That's not production costs. That's not advertising. That is to pay the purse for your main event fighters, two of them. So you understand the risk PFL took. And also the idea that, it's going to be tough to recoup our costs when it comes to a Francis Ngannou fight. Maybe it's worth it for all the press. It did get a lot of press. Maybe it's worth it to get eyeballs on other people who are less expensive, who can then main event a pay-per-view, all kinds of stuff. Okay, right. Your financially, it's going to cost you a lot. You got to get a lot out of that. So both sides have valid points about why the UFC didn't sign Francis Ngannou and why PFL did. The nuts and bolts are very, very simple. When it comes to the heavyweight debate right now, the last fighter to be consensus number one, and this is where rankings were all over the place, so, there were a lot of different rankings, but Fedor was universally the number one heavyweight in MMA and lost to Fabricio Verdum in Strikeforce. That was the last time a fighter was number one in a particular weight class, not in the UFC. That was the last time. And it hasn't happened since. There have been good fighters in other promotions for sure. A consensus number one who wasn't fighting in the UFC hasn't happened since Fedor. And the trouble with the heavyweight division, period, end of sentence, is we have American football. It's the same problem you have in boxing. I was talking to Steve Farhood one time, who is a boxing legend. He knows everything about boxing. And we were talking about kind of the dip in the heavyweight division of a few years ago. It's pretty good now. And I said, man, heavyweight division isn't very good. And he turned to me and he goes, it usually isn't very good. It's hard, look at Mike Tyson. Mike Tyson ruled over a division that really wasn't very good. He goes, we have these bright spots. In the 90s, for example, when you had Riddick Bowe, Evander Holyfield, Lennox Lewis, Michael Moore, George Foreman, all in and around the same era-ish, mid to late 90s. He goes, that's really rare. He goes, usually there's one guy at heavyweight. He's the attraction, and everybody watches him. He's like, that's normal. The era of Ali, where you had, he faced, I think, 14 Hall of Famers or something like that. You're not going to see that again. And the reason is we have American football. If you are athletic and 6'6" and 270 pounds, you're on a football field. Right, you're signing a rookie deal that makes you more money than you will ever make in combat sports. Unless you are, once again, heavyweight champion making real money. It's just, and there are more spots on a football field, football roster in the NFL than there are spots at top of the heavyweight division. You're lucky to make decent money if you're a top 10 guy. So the idea that in America there's this gigantic barrier of big athletic guys going into combat sports. They just don't do it that often. They end up playing football and making more money if they can. And if they fail and they decide to go to MMA, Greg Hardy, it's too late. Your body's been through too much. You're never going to be great starting at 25 after a pro career in football. It's never going to happen. So that's why, and Greg Hardy's a great example, heavyweights make so much money and the UFC holds on to them in the way they do, is they're very rare. A really good heavyweight, who people even know who you are and want to see you fight, is real rare. There aren't a lot of them. And so heavyweights tend to make, as compared to the weight classes, much more money. You can stick around a lot longer. You can make a lot more money. You can be successful later. You don't need the speed of a 125 or 135er where, late 20s is getting old. You can... George Foreman won a heavyweight title at 45. Now, that's an exception to the rule, but Andrei Arlovski, meaningful fights late in his career. Heavyweights can just do what they do later. So you tend to hold on to them. That being said, that's why I don't believe at all Dana White's I was going to cut Francis Ngannou after his second loss in that terrible fight to Derek Lewis, UFC 226. No, he wasn't going to, right? You don't cut a guy like Francis Ngannou who looks like him, fights like him after two losses. You would at very least make him a gatekeeper, throw guy, Andrei Arlovski. You would at very least, Travis Brown, okay, this guy's not going to be a champion. Make him the gatekeeper, have him fight the Young Bucks, blah, 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 blah. You don't get rid of a big, hard-hitting heavyweight off two losses. I don't care how bad those losses were, and they were both bad, and they were both dominant. My first show on the Fox desk for the UFC was Stipe Ngannou, and Stipe owned him. And so he lost twice. I don't believe for 1 second Dana White was actually going to cut him. He may have considered it for a second. Dana can be a little emotional after the fight. I'm getting rid of this guy. I don't believe he was really going to do that. Simply because heavyweights are just too freaking valuable. And as Ngannou showed, he turned it around, ended up going on a streak and becoming champion. Hasn't lost since. So the idea that Dana was going to get rid of him, to me, that's fiction. I don't believe that. So Ngannou, it will turn things around, go on a streak, and it is where he is now in PFL. The problem that PFL is going to have is having a great fighter is like having a shark in a tank. You got to keep him fed. I remember if you've seen Cocaine Cowboys, the documentary, he had a stable of horses. And he goes, racing horses. He goes, it's $50,000 a month to feed those things. And I went, Jesus. And he goes, yeah, makes sense. A stable of breeding horses and racing horses. Similar kind of thing. It's just you're constantly shelling out big money to get decent heavyweights to even make this guy look good. Now, destroyed Hidden Fajeda in the first round. He beats everybody on the PFL Bellator roster, in my opinion. One of the difficulties when Bellator came in, they brought in a lot of talent to PFL. Not a lot in the heavyweight division. Ryan Bader is, of course, champion. He's a puffed up light heavyweight, really long in the tooth, into his 40s. Doesn't have the size to beat Ngannou, in my opinion. And so one of the problems when I was in Bellator was building up the heavyweight division. It's not easy for the reasons I just said. They're so valuable. They're so hard to find. The UFC will pay top dollar for a top heavyweight. So you're almost always paying almost free agent prices for a heavyweight. So they got to keep him fed, and that's really expensive. And he's made, once again, a minimum for his opponent, which is apparently $2 million. What are you going to throw some garbage heavyweight to keep him busy, and it's $2 million a pop? That's going to be really tough. You remember the Mike Tyson days, Tony Tubbs and guys that fought Mike Tyson had no chance. But, the overhead wasn't that high. And, Mike Tyson fight was an event that people were willing to pay for. So that's the difficulty, is you have to keep him fed with talent. And heavyweight, when I was at Bellator, was really tough to keep the heavyweight division stacked. And then PFL's got to do it now. And it's never easy to do. It's always hard to keep a good heavyweight division. UFC, its worst division ever was heavyweight in the Andrei Arlovsky, Tim Sylvia years, when they were flipping the title back and forth. I mean, you had Paul Buentello, Justin Eilers, anybody? Yeah, fighting for titles. You're like, it was bad. Pride had a much better heavyweight division. So they're going to have trouble keeping him supplied with talent. On the other side, we have, for the first time in my memory, a situation, which is very possible. After Stipe John Jones goes, I'm out of here, bye, it's been great. And we have, of this era, however you want to define it, 3 guys you could say are the top heavyweight. John Jones, Tom Aspinall, and Francis Ngannou. I don't remember the last time we had this kind of murky waters in any division. Yeah, when Khabib left, right? Oh, who's the next? But it's still the next guy. It's, all right, Khabib's gone. This is the next guy. If you consider John Jones gone, he's no longer a factor. Okay, it's Aspinall and Ngannou, and they're never going to fight. And I've been big on Aspinall from the beginning. I think he's amazing. But it's one of the few times we get a controversy about who's the best heavyweight. I think the best heavyweight right now of this era is Ngannou, of this particular era, however you want to define it, last couple of years. When I look at the streak, from not so much the streak. A streak of wins since Curtis Blades is something else. But, since entering the UFC, Andrei Arlovsky, Alistair Overeem, Curtis Blades, Cain Velasquez, Junior Dos Santos, Yarinho Rozenstruik, Stipe Miocic, Cyril Gane. And then, of course, the Hidden Fajeda knockout. That's a hell of a run. That is. You have the 2 losses after his first 2 fights to Miocic and Derek Lewis. But that's a hell of a run. The one thing working against John Jones is he's had 1 fight at heavyweight. 1. And he beat Cyril Gane. Great. I don't think Cyril Gane's great necessarily. I think he probably beat Stipe. Stipe's way past his competitive prime. He just doesn't have that run at heavyweight for me to think he's number 1 of this era. No matter how dominant he is, it's just 2 fights, one of them against a guy who's shot. So I believe is shot. Now, Stipe might surprise me, but I find it hard to believe that Stipe is going to win that one. And then you have Tom Aspinall. While Tom Aspinall, I think skill set wise, when I look at him, the things he can do, looks like a freaking 145-pounder in a heavyweight frame. He can move, and he's accurate and versatile and all this stuff, has real power. When I look at his skill set, I don't see a better skill set in the heavyweight division right now than Tom Aspinall. But when I look at the run of names and the breadth of his heavyweight career and where he's peaking right now, I got to go with Ngannou. Now, a lot of those guys, and I'm sure in the comment section I'm going to hear it, weren't in their primes. I don't think Alistair was in his prime. Stipe, you could argue, was not in his prime at the time. So some of the big names, some of the old lions, yeah, sure, Arlovsky, not in his prime. But just that run of names. Curtis Blades, very, very good. Destroyed him. Kane, certainly at the end with injuries. But when you look at that run from whatever it is, 2017 to now, it's impressive. And no one in the heavyweight division has that run. Aspinall's just getting started. John Jones never really had it at heavyweight. I think he's the greatest pound for pound of all time. So it's leading to this controversy in the heavyweight division that I think is extremely compelling. Extremely compelling. Will Ngannou ever fight Tom Aspinall or John Jones? No. Don't think that ever happens. Dana White said he's not doing business with the guy anymore. It's not going to happen. The funny thing to me is when I look at, if you saw the Mr. McMahon documentary, Vince McMahon talking about Bret Hart, and he signed him to this huge deal, and later he regretted it, and he went, just make another star. I don't need to spend money on this guy. I can make another star. That's always going to be Dana's attitude. If you leave the UFC long enough, we're going to forget about you. Meaning the MMA fans. We're going to forget about you. Right now, PFL doing a great job of keeping Francis Ngannou in the limelight, but that's Dana's philosophy, right? You will eventually, lose. You're going to lose to somebody eventually. And losing somebody outside the UFC, whoosh, you're basically done. And, will the MMA fans keep talking about Francis Ngannou when he beats some guy and some guy and some guy if PFL is not able to supply him with names? It's all very, very stacked on the side of Dana White. Dana White can wait him out. When Roger Huerta, who was a huge star, left the UFC on 2 losses, tough losses, close losses, went to Bellator, lost against Pat Curran. That was it. Gone. And people who were around remember what a big star he was, and he's just gone. It's that idea that without our press behind you, the MMA fans will move on to the next heavyweight. It's going to be our heavyweight. So Dana, I think, can wait this out a lot better. And Ngannou right now made a bag of money in boxing, taking on Anthony Joshua and Tyson Fury. He's not really motivated to come crawling back because he's out of money. He's just not going to. PFL is paying him very, very well. Even if you walked off right now, unless he's an idiot and blew through his money, which he doesn't seem like that kind of guy, he's got enough money. He doesn't need to come back. He doesn't need to come, because he'd have to come crawling back, and I don't think he's going to do that. And I think Dana White, once again, he has enough money. I don't think he needs to do that. So these two opposing forces don't really have a reason to come together. They don't. So I think that's where we're going to stay. But it's going to be interesting to see. Let me know what you think in the comment section. Who's the best heavyweight right now? Talk to you soon.